August 16th, 1943, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British Eighth Army, hero of El Alamein, the most celebrated Allied general of the war, was certain. The race was already his. His staff had circulated the maps. His supply convoys were pressed forward. His infantry was grinding up the eastern coast of Sicily toward the port of Messina. The prize! The key to the entire island. The gateway to mainland Italy. Montgomery's plan was meticulous. His timetable, in his own estimation, was sound. There was just one problem. Nobody had told George S. Patton. On the morning of August 17th, 1943, the first Allied soldiers to enter the fallen city of Messina were not British. They were American. And the general who put them there, a man who had been explicitly assigned to guard a flank, to stay secondary, to let Montgomery have his moment, was already on his way to claim it. How did Patton beat Montgomery to Messina? The answer begins 6 weeks earlier, on a moonlit sea south of Sicily, and with a plan that nearly guaranteed Patton would never get the chance. In the early hours of July 10th, 1943, the Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was the largest amphibious operation in history to that point. Over 150,000 troops, nearly 3,000 ships, more than 4,000 aircraft, 8 Allied divisions, hitting the beaches simultaneously along a 100-mile front. The strategic objective was clear: take Sicily, threaten the Italian mainland, force Germany to fight on yet another front. Churchill had called Italy the soft underbelly of the Axis. Sicily was the blade. They intended to drive into it. The plan divided the island between two commanders. On the eastern flank, General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery and his British Eighth Army. These were the men who had broken Rommel at El Alamein. Veterans of the Western Desert, the most experienced combat formation the Allies possessed. Montgomery's axis of advance would carry him straight up Highway 114, through Catania, past the slopes of Mount Etna, and north to Messina. It was the more direct route, and in General Harold Alexander's operational plan. It was the main effort, the decisive role, the starring role. On the western flank, Lieutenant General George S. Patton and the U.S. Seventh Army. His mission was to land near Gela and Licata, push inland, and guard Montgomery's left flank. In plain terms, hold the line, keep the Germans off the British, and stay out of the way. From the very beginning, Patton seethed. Patton was 57 years old that summer, a student of military history who read Caesar and Napoleon in their original languages, a cavalry officer, a tank commander, a man who had spent decades thinking about war. He genuinely believed, not as a pose, but as a deep personal conviction, that he had been born to wage war. Being assigned a supporting role behind Montgomery was not a disappointment. It was, in Patton's private view, a humiliation. His diary entries from those first days crackle with barely contained fury. "I feel that I must get on," he wrote. "I cannot wait." The opening days of the campaign only sharpened the frustration. On July 11th, just 24 hours after the landings, Patton's beachhead at Gela nearly collapsed. The Hermann Goering Panzer Division drove a column of tanks directly toward the beach. At one point, German armor was close enough to see the masts of Allied ships in the harbor. What stopped them was not armor. It was naval gunfire, point-blank artillery, and American infantrymen standing their ground when every instinct said run. It was an extraordinary stand, and it was almost entirely overlooked, because over on the eastern flank, Montgomery's army was making the news. Montgomery's army was the story. Then the story changed. By mid-July, the British Eighth Army had stopped. The terrain east of Mount Etna was nothing like the open desert, where Montgomery had built his reputation. The roads narrowed to single lanes, carved into cliff faces. The river crossings were few, easily demolished, and overlooked by heights that German paratroopers and panzer grenadiers held with grim efficiency. The town of Catania, which Montgomery expected to take within days of landing, would not fall until August 5th. His entire timetable was unraveling, and Alexander, watching the stall from above, quietly authorized Patton to expand the Seventh Army's operations. It was, perhaps, the most consequential decision of the entire Sicilian campaign, because Patton didn't walk through that door. He exploded through it. Patton moved before the ink on his orders was dry. With General Keyes driving directly west and General Omar Bradley's 2 corps securing the center, the Seventh Army swung across the Sicilian interior in a drive that stunned even Patton's own staff. 200 miles? 5 days. Patton himself traveled with the leading elements. July 22nd, 1943. Just 12 days after the landings, American forces entered Palermo, the ancient Norman capital of Sicily. Patton arrived that evening. He drove through streets detonating with celebration. Church bells ringing, women throwing roses, men pressing forward just to touch the American vehicles. He established his headquarters in the royal palace of the Norman kings. The symbolism was deliberate. Patton chose that palace, the way a conqueror chooses a palace, because it said something about him, about his army, about what had just happened. But privately, in his diary that night, he was already looking east. "Palermo is a great gift," he wrote. "Messina will be the decision." He pivoted immediately. Now 2 Allied armies were converging on Messina from opposite directions. Montgomery pressing north along the eastern coast, his advance measured in yards. Patton driving east along Highway 113, his advance measured in miles. Neither commander would openly call it a race. It was, without question, a race, and the road Patton had chosen was a trap. The northern coast of Sicily is not open country. It is a brutal succession of ridgelines that fall almost vertically into the Tyrrhenian Sea. The river gorges are deep and sudden. The road clings to the cliffside. A handful of resolute defenders could stop an entire division cold. The Germans knew exactly what they had. Remnants of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division pulled back to each defensible ridge in sequence, buying time with brutal efficiency. They blew every bridge. They mined every route. They cut demolition charges into the cliff faces above the road, dropping tons of rock across the highway where it offered no way around. At the Furiano River, at Capocalava, at San Fratello Ridge, they bled the advancing infantry for every single yard. Patton's attack was stalling, and he had exactly zero intention of letting it stay that way. His solution was to stop fighting the terrain altogether, go around it. On August 8th, Patton ordered the first of 3 amphibious hook operations along the northern coast. Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard led a battalion of the 30th Infantry Regiment onto the beach at Sant'Agata di Militello, landing behind the German defensive line, threatening to encircle the defenders. Before they could react, the Germans withdrew. The road opened. The advance resumed. The second landing, on August 11th near Brolo, was more desperate. Bernard's battalion landed in darkness, seized the high ground above the coastal road. But the main American force couldn't break through fast enough. For 36 agonizing hours, the battalion sat isolated on its ridge, surrounded, short of ammunition, fighting off repeated German counterattacks. There was a furious confrontation between Patton and General Lucian Truscott over the timing. Truscott wanted to wait. Patton wanted the landing now. "Every day we waste," Patton told him. "The British get closer." Truscott launched. The battalion held. the main force broke through. And then, August 15th, a third landing near Spadafora, just 15 miles from Messina itself. By this point, something was happening on the other side of the strait that the Allies were desperately trying to prevent, and failing. Since August 11th, German forces had been executing Operation Lehrgang, a systematic, meticulously organized evacuation across the 3-kilometer strait to the Italian mainland, ferries running day and night, artillery suppressing Allied intervention. Over 12 days, more than 100,000 men crossed, nearly 10,000 vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, tanks. The Allies, consumed by the race for Messina, couldn't stop it. But the race itself was nearly over. August 17th, 1943. Before first light, the last German rearguard unit completed its crossing. The engines of the final ferry faded into the darkness. The defensive guns fell silent. Messina stood empty. After 38 days of fighting across the entire breadth of Sicily, the city that both armies had bled to reach had no defenders left to surrender it. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, a patrol from the 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, moved through the outskirts of the city. There was no fire. There was almost no one. A few old men in doorways, a handful of women watching from shuttered windows. The smell of smoke and dust, and the particular silence of a place where a battle has just ended. The Americans were inside Messina. Roughly an hour later, an advance party from the British 4th Armored Brigade arrived at the city's edge. They found Americans already there, already shaking hands, already photographing the harbor, already looking out across the strait, at the mountains of Calabria on the far shore. When word reached Patton, he moved with the instinct of a man who understood one truth. Above all others in that moment, a victory not witnessed is a victory half lost. He reached Messina by mid-morning. Riding through streets that still tasted of smoke and cordite, he climbed to a vantage point above the harbor. He looked out across the 3 kilometers of open water to the Italian mainland. Then Brigadier John Curry of the 4th Armored Brigade arrived and extended his hand. "It was a jolly good race," Curry said. Patton smiled. "Congratulations," he replied. "Your people were right behind us." One of the great understatements of the Second World War, delivered with complete awareness of exactly what it was. The Sicilian campaign was over. 38 days, 160 miles of fighting. What had been designed as a supporting operation, a flank guard, a secondary effort, had become something the planners never intended. Proof that American armies, properly led and ferociously motivated, could outmaneuver anyone on the battlefield. Patton knew precisely what he had done. He made sure the record showed it. Montgomery's public reaction was measured, diplomatic, carefully composed. In his memoirs, he dismissed the rivalry as a press invention, insisting the 2 Allied armies had played complementary roles, each contributing to a shared success. His private diaries were less gracious. They reveal a commander frustrated by the terrain, stung by the supply failures, and quietly reckoning with an uncomfortable reality. He had not been beaten by superior numbers or good fortune. He had been beaten by speed. Patton had simply moved faster, made decisions faster, accepted risk faster. And in Sicily's particular geography, that difference had been everything. General Harold Alexander, the overall ground commander, worked carefully to frame the campaign as a unified success. In strategic terms, he had the evidence to support it. Sicily fell completely. The island's capture had triggered a political earthquake in Rome. On July 25th, while the campaign was still raging, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The dictator was arrested that same night, bundled into an ambulance, and driven away from his own government. The road to Italy was open. Alexander's after-action reports attributed the fall of Messina to the Allied effort as a whole. No single army was credited, but among soldiers, and among the historians who followed, the meaning of August 17th was inescapable. Military historian Carlo D'Este, who wrote what remains the definitive biography of Patton, argued that the Sicilian campaign represented his finest operational performance of the entire war. Not the most famous, not the largest, the finest. Because in Sicily, Patton did something harder than winning a pitched battle. He invented a new campaign from within the boundaries of someone else's plan. The dash to Palermo, the pivot east, the amphibious hooks up the northern coast. These were not improvisations born of luck. They were the expression of a military mind that understood one thing above all else. The initiative, once seized, must never be surrendered. Montgomery's reputation underwent a quieter reassessment in the years that followed. His defenders were not wrong to point to the obstacles: the mountains, the paratroopers at Catania, the supply failures, all real, all severe. But his critics returned, always, to a single question. Facing those same obstacles, what would Patton have done? The two men embodied a philosophical divide that ran through Allied strategy from Sicily to the Rhine. On one side, the deliberate commander, the set-piece battle, overwhelming preparation before a single soldier moves forward. Montgomery, on the other, the aggressive commander. Constant pressure. Exploit every opening before the enemy can close it. Never give him time to think. Patton. Neither philosophy was pure. Neither was wholly wrong. Great campaigns in that war required both. But in Sicily, on the coastal roads between Palermo and Messina, one philosophy arrived first. There is one last thing. The finish line tends to obscure those 100,000 German soldiers who crossed the Strait of Messina with their artillery, their armor, their experience, their discipline, did not disappear. They went to ground on the Italian mainland, and 6 weeks later, they were waiting at Salerno when the Allied landings came. They held the line at Monte Cassino for months. They made Anzio a near catastrophe. The failure to seal the strait cost the Allied armies tens of thousands of casualties in the campaigns ahead. Even the most dramatic victories carry their complications. Even the greatest races can have an ambiguous prize. But on the morning of August 17th, 1943, none of that had yet arrived. What existed in that moment, in the streets of Messina, with the smoke still rising from the harbor and the straight silver in the morning light, was something simpler and more permanent. A general who had been told to guard the flank had looked up, made a decision, and crossed the finish line first. The story of Patton and Montgomery in Sicily is ultimately a story about what happens when ambition refuses to accept its assigned boundaries. It is a story about two philosophies of war colliding on a sun-scorched island, and about what an army can accomplish when it is led by someone who genuinely cannot stand to lose. If that story stayed with you, there are two things we'd ask. Subscribe, so you're here when the next episode drops, and leave a comment below, telling us which thread from the Sicily campaign you'd like to pull next. The near disaster at Gela on July 11th, when German tanks nearly reached the beach, the night Mussolini was arrested, while the campaign was still raging. The German evacuation itself, one of the most audacious military extractions of the entire war. We read everything. And if you want to follow Patton beyond Sicily, our next episode covers August 1944. Normandy is broken open. The breakout is underway. And Patton's Third Army is about to do in France what he did in Sicily, except on a scale that left even his admirers struggling to find the words for it. Same general, larger stage, higher stakes. Patton once said, "May God have mercy upon my enemies, because I won't." After Sicily, nobody in the Allied command doubted it, not even Montgomery.